relationship between the mind, the person, and wine. Because since in order to be a neurophysician, you have to study first neurophysiology. How does the brain and our central nervous system reacts and interacts with the world around, and how some pathologies do modify, even in a very serious way, this situation. In the same way, the relationship between food intake, food choice, and wine was appealing and was something that I was interested in knowing better. What I didn't want to know were specific technicalities. So still now, if you ask me, tell me about ampelography, which sort of soil is there, don't know. But I survive in a very nice mood with this lack of knowledge. On the other hand, I try every day to share, because it's a community experience. It's never something me and the wine. It's always something which is shared with other friends and people. What does this wine has to tell me? Which is the message that I can find if I am able to search, and am I capable of waiting and be patient and listen to the message of wine rather than to be in a rush for trying to draw any information in a rapid and very aggressive approach. Well, there are two things one has to keep in mind. The first thing is all the detectors, all the systems we have in order to analyze this perfumed liquid that we're going to introduce. We have the sight, so we have visual inputs, we have the colors, we have taste, and we have smell. All those are in some way separate items, but the very important and nice thing is that our brain is planned in order to analyze separate data, but to integrate and elaborate into a whole system. So as far as we were talking a few minutes ago about courses and official sommelier courses and so on, to understand a wine, first you have to dialogue. And to dialogue, you have to open your heart. You don't have to try to guess the name, the label, the vintage. The important thing, does this Rosso or white wine has anything to tell me? And that is through those data, but mainly through the integration and interpretation that you make within your brain. And your brain goes back to his memory bank, tries to find analogies or contradictions, try to find experiences from a point of view of perfume, of color, of scent, of texture of that wine, which may be related to previous experience, or at the very beginning they just stack up, they just fill up the baggage of experience and information. So when you say the relationship between the brain and wine, you have to think always of one human being to whom the brain belongs, who is free, open-minded, and in a appropriate context. For instance, wine, by tradition, from centuries, is a social experience. They used to say in Greece, symposion. We drink together. Symposion, sympone in Greek, means I drink with. And in our tradition in Southern Europe, wine is linked to drink together, to have a shared community of people who meet to share food and wine. And we call them, again, with the ancient Greek names. We call them agape, which means we are together around the table, and we call it koinonia, which means we share values and languages that belong to our group and that we use according to our experience in the world of wine. Third, there is an important and interesting experiment by a friend, a colleague in Canada, who has shown that if you take a panel in order to test the wine, and the panel is split into two parts. One part of young students, very smart, with extremely good notes, going very well and proceeding to the graduation very rapidly, with a nice personal satisfactory situation, with a girlfriend, in their best mood, and you put them in the same room, tasting the same wines, same vintage, everything as far as the wines are concerned is identical, but the other part of the panel are the same number of students who have problems with their examinations, who are not extremely good at the university, who will have problems in asking their parents to pay the fees for the university because they are in a situation where they are not following the right steps. Plus, maybe they have no satisfactory relationship with the girl in that moment. And at the very end, they drank the same wines in the same setting, in the same moment. Well, what was measured was the capability of being involved in the message of the wine by saying, I have found and felt this, and this has interested or has involved me or did tell me something. Well, all this participation, involvement, capability of being in touch with the wine was much higher in the part of the sample where the students in well-being conditions were, rather than in the other part, although the age was the same, the situation was the same, and the wines were the same. So our personal, subjective, individual attitude takes an important role, plays an important role, and has to be taken into account when some gurus give notes to wine. Some friends say, oh, who knows how was feeling Mr. So-and-so when he gave 81 rather than 94 to that wine. What happened? In which situation did that happen? Well, this is somehow a way of extremizing the thing, but I think that the subjective factor is always to be taken into account. First of all, it's extremely difficult to put in strict evidence-based relation emotions with neurophysiology, because neurophysiology was born in order to evaluate and describe very basic phenomena, which are movement, senses, temperature, and that sort of things. What I can tell you is that there are specific parts of the brain who make a certain work and who are in charge of certain functions. For instance, when I say we need, as in a movie, somebody directing the movie, otherwise you lose all the things. Well, as far as the sensory system, which means sight, olfaction, scent, taste, sensory in the sense of texture of the wine and sensations, all these data come from different parts of our body and mainly of the head, but they all converge, they are all concentrated in this big switchboard and at the same time, if you want, server, which is, the server is the thalamus, where there are specific areas for the vision, the fine touch, the hard touch, temperature, and so on. from there, once they have been analyzed and distinguished, they are projected, so they are sent to the areas where labels are put, or if you want, identification or recognition takes place. The occipital lobe for vision, the temporal lobe for the music and the acoustic senses. And so in that way, you have this process of what we call incoming data. What happens later is that from one point of view, you have all these inputs. You recognize them, then you send them back to the data bank of the memory, which is at the base of the brain. And it is only after that you can put in relationship rough data, which are color, temperature, taste, texture, to the emotion that belonged to you when that piece of data were recorded. And in that way, you can't say that there is what we call a specific localization mechanism. Because in order to make up your mind and to tell me, you know, apart from the example of the Madeleine de Proust, I feel as if I was in that place with that. You have to put together all those systems, and I used the example of the Windows system. You have several windows open on the same screen, and they all talk together to let you make up your mind. So I need specific, distinguished areas of the brain in order to perform specific tasks. But the global evaluation, the answer, the opinion I give you is the result of a global work which needs a deep and constant interaction between those areas. It depends on the way you were taught. In a very unconventional and maybe politically not correct way, I recognize at first sight my wine tasting friends who come from a very strict sommelier study, so their brain has been programmed somehow in order to search for and define some items which become priorities. So their soul, their deep heart are not free, because the brain sends messages. You have to find the scent of the grass freshly cut on that hill on the east side of the vineyard during a sunset in late September, and all that sort of things. So memory, if you have stocked a huge amount of data, but you have not passed them through the experience of fulfillment, that's not only not important, may become a problem. On the other hand, knowledge can distract from pleasure. Pleasure has something to do with knowledge in a very, very limited way. Because if knowledge is the capability of defining things, then as far as the relationship you establish with the wine has something to tell you. There is a man behind it, there is a story, there is a terroir, there is a history. So if you want to find those 5 or 6 words that show that you belong to the happy few who know how to say the correct word with the perfect adjective in the specific place, then you waste your time and your attention is diverted to other things. So it depends. I think that a naive taster may tell us in some situations much more than a Hezbollah sommelier. By Hezbollah I mean a Taliban-minded taster, you see? It's much more holistic, the approach, in the sense that the rewarding system and the pleasure systems are strictly linked to the prefrontal cortex and the other areas in the limbic system. But if you ask me, how does the limbic system, the part of the brain which has to do with memory and emotions, influence your opinion? I say, yes, it is true that the emotional percentage, the weight of the emotion you feel during the tasting play a role. But then the experience and the capability of distinguishing different levels makes a difference, in the sense that you can fall in love with the wine at first sight. It's okay. But if you have, and this is very well seen on functional MRI, if you have a background, like for instance Alessandro, of thousands of wines drunk, experience celebrated, and you have put together not only the categories of wine, but even the emotional label you put on those, then you're less likely to be influenced purely by the prefrontal cortex, because the neocortex upwards is somehow controlling it, and automatically, without your will filter that by saying, remember, although it seems that it is fantastic, you know that you drank that, and you have those scent, color, and texture references. And through that, there is a constant exchange of data between the neocortex in the other part of the brain and the prefrontal cortex, so that the percentage of pure emotional evaluation in the experienced taster plays a less important role, although it may happen that there is an overwhelming force of that wine which may bypass any sort of rational or logical evaluation, and you are purely taken by your limbic system, and what comes out is just your profound feeling of involvement and pleasure. That could even happen. But it's much easier and more frequent in the newcomers, in the beginners, rather than in experienced drinkers. Drinking wine reduces the barriers between the members of the human race, and it lowers the defense tools in as far as the relationship between person is concerned. It facilitates, it helps relationships. Why? Because the rewarding systems that are elicited but are activated by wine use as tools, as a language, as a mean of communication, the same neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, and adrenaline, that are boosted by other substances that are not wine, but which are capable of activating hardly and strongly these systems, and these are the mushrooms like peyote and mescal, and these are the erythrotoxin cocaine, and they do the same thing at higher level and much more powerfully, but still activating the same neurotransmitters and the same pathways and circuits. So, at a lower level, at reasonable doses, euphoria, happiness, relaxation, gaining distance from everyday's anxiety is something which allows us to use at reasonable quantities wine with that purpose. The tiny border is that we are experiencing that because our brain is activating the same substances, the same transmitters, the same chemical agents that are boosted much more powerfully by drugs. So we have to know that as far as excitement, hyperactivity, the way of losing control of our behavior is concerned, it is always that system which is involved. Much more powerfully with some drugs, less powerfully, but still in a measurable way, when we drink wine. The French paradox is something which involves me because it's linked to situations that belong to my everyday life as a physician. Because in the early 80s, around 84 and 86, cardiologists in Bordeaux published the first study about the point: how do we explain that French people who do not have in central northern France olive oil, who eat a lot of fat in pig fat, such as bacon and other things, who have a diet which is not at all low fat, low cholesterol, have, compared to people in Northern Europe, where olive oil does not exist at all, but because at least in France, in Côte d'Azur or in Provence, you have olive oil. But if you compare, on the whole, cerebral and cardiovascular diseases in France and in Northern Europe, in that moment, they found that people were having less strokes and less infarcts, and the mortality was lower in France. The explanation they found was that in France, the dietary habits include regularly, all over the country, drinking wine, and mainly red wine. Well, at that moment, the move was very smart, so that the Bordeaux Winery Association took the organization of the whole thing. They involved a friend of mine whose name was Jean-Marc Rogozo, who was the neurologist of the University of Bordeaux, and they targeted on the prevention of stroke with Bordeaux wine and the prevention of vascular dementia, which is, you know, although the dementia is more or less 60% is Alzheimer, but the other 40% is for vascular diseases. And the core point was that reasonable limited amounts of wine, that means 2 glasses, not a bottle, 2 glasses of wine per meal, with the meal, while you are eating, not with your with nothing alone, would reduce the risk of cardio and cerebrovascular diseases. The scientific explanation was linked to the role of antioxidative action of some components of the wine, mainly some substances which belong to the family of phenols, and these flavonoids, and the specific substance which has been thereafter sold in thousands of ways is resveratrol. So it is true, we have to say, there has been an advertising campaign very well done. They have exploited the data very well. They have sold the product in a very smart way, but the hardcore, the center of the problem was correct, although some Northern American researchers later wanted to dismantle the theory by objecting about some details of the studies performed. Still, further studies in the Mediterranean area, for instance in Greece and in Sicily, by chance, because of the same reason, but they showed, different researchers, not any link with wine producers, wine associations, they showed that dementia and stroke were much lower. For instance, in Italy we have a wonderful study in the Aeolian Islands, and others have studies in Greece. Those with Mediterranean diet, not only wine, but that includes mainly red wine, had a much better outcome as far as heart disease and stroke is concerned. You take me on a tricky path, because although it is tantalizing to escape towards a epistemology approach, which would be complicated and of low interest, you still have to think that in our Western European culture, we have these roots which are very deep. I mean, beauty is something which in our Greek culture was strictly linked to an ethical evaluation. That was called kalos kai agathos, which kalos was nice, handsome, beautiful, and agathos was correct, honest, of many more qualities. And that was all together. You could not split it. So that in our culture, the idea of splitting and conceiving separately beauty and pleasure is profound. Because beauty, if you go back to Aristotle or even more recently to Kant, it's something which goes beyond everyday's experience. And in terms of Aristotle, it was metaphysics, beyond the physical things or beyond the books concerning physical things. Kant said that beauty was something desire-free, universally valid, and which was some sort of pure out of everyday people's life. So with this history behind, our approach, in my mind, as neuroscientists, would be purely lay. So with no philosophical or even religious background. Otherwise, we're going to mix up several things and make confusion. So, in my mind, what I would say is, let's think of something which is useful. You know very well, being a neuroscientist, that we are built in our brain according to the evolution, so that we have a very old brain with the archicortex. We have an intermediate brain, the paleocortex, and we have the part of cortex which is linked to our human nature, which is neocortex. Well, you know very well what we do with. But if we go back to Aristotle, and we go back 2,000 and more years ago, you will find that in his conception, in his theories, there were three types of souls. There is one soul which was concerned about survival, food, and reproduction. Doesn't that remind you of the basic instinct of lower grade animals, what we call the archicortex? Then there was a second soul for Aristotle, which was sensory inputs, learning, and memory, which was somehow intermediate, and somehow that could have something to deal with what we call paleocortex. Then, as far as thought elaboration, analysis, planning, and free will, then you deal with the neocortex. But these three things, thought elaboration, analysis, and planning, are not part of the neuroscientific approach. These were categorized and described by Aristotle 2,000 and more years ago. So if we have to deal with beauty and pleasure, we have to concede that, in my mind, we have to be very, very lay. We don't have to have any religious or even philosophical or moral approach. We have to analyze data and have experimental approach to those things. So, as far as wine is concerned, beauty is something that may have a place according to some criteria. But what we deal with, as far as wine is concerned, is mainly pleasure. And that is linked to mechanisms that you very well know that are behind our behavior and which are based on the pursuit, the research, and the satisfaction of pleasure. And we have been built within our brain with an hardware which is organized from the neuroanatomical and neurofunctional point of view on the base of rewarding system. your behavior is precisely oriented to the pursuit and the satisfaction of the search for pleasure. Wine is one of the best tools we have been dealing with for 2000 years. The way we deal with it may change very much according to culture, to situations, to people, but the basic pillars remain the same in my mind. But we have a problem. Sorry for interrupting. We have a problem which is very important if we want to understand these things. In our culture, in our societies, mainly in the western part of the world, pleasure is a taboo. It has been the object for centuries of rules, limits, and pleasure is strictly linked to the concept of forbidden. So that in very different contexts in Europe and even in Northern America, you will find that for the last 5 centuries, as far as Europe is concerned, more recently for the States, pleasure should be sought with moderation. Pleasure must be earned. Pleasure must be achieved naturally. Pleasure is transitory, and the denial of pleasure can yield to spiritual growth. With those premises, with these ideas, wine is a perfect candidate for damnation. Its pathway to hell is already described, because our everyday experimental data tell us that it helps a lot in the research and in the experience of pleasure. So since pleasure has been something to be limited, to be considered as a risky activity, wine refers to a part of the life and behavior which, let's think of the Puritanism in Northern America, or let's think of a very precise moment of the history when, during the 20th century, there was a period, as you very well know, where alcohol was banned. And so, for us in this country, in Italy, it's totally different. We have been drinking wine for 2,500 years. The Greek, and maybe some the Phoenicians, maybe before, brought grapes to us, and we have been producing wine as a part of our everyday life. And pleasure was natural, was spontaneous, was part of everyday life before Christ, and it has become after Christ. Because, the church is extremely smart, so they took the wine and they put it into the Mass. So it became part of the liturgy. And it seems that drunkenness from vino da messa, the wine of the Mass, was more tolerated than drunkenness from other sort of wines. So beauty and pleasure, for a long time, and even today, let's think of cultures and religions where alcohol is strictly banned, may belong in some situation to perfectly separate fields, although our brain treats them, deals with them, and interacts with them in a very deep and tightened way.